Most people think a dopamine detox means going silent for a weekend and coming back refreshed. That's not what happens. Here's what actually changes in your brain when you remove the noise. Your brain isn't addicted to screens or social media. It's addicted to the pattern of reward unpredictability, the variable ratio schedule that every low-value input is running on. Remove the input, and the system doesn't instantly reset. It recalibrates, and that recalibration process is where everything that matters actually happens. In this video, I'll break down the actual neuroscience of what changes during a dopamine detox and what you have to do to make that change permanent instead of temporary. Before we go anywhere, let's establish something. The phrase dopamine detox is technically a misnomer. You're not flushing dopamine out of your system the way you'd flush toxins out of your blood. Dopamine doesn't work that way. What you're actually doing is changing the conditions under which your brain's reward circuitry fires, and more specifically, you're interrupting a feedback loop that has been quietly shaping your behavior for months, maybe years. The distinction matters because if you think of it as a cleanse, you'll treat it like a cleanse. You'll do it for a few days, feel slightly better, and return to the same environment with the same inputs. And within a week, the baseline resets right back to where it was. The people who get lasting results from this process treat it as a system-level intervention, not a temporary break. So what's actually happening in the brain? When you repeatedly engage with high-frequency, low-effort stimulation, short videos, notification pulses, social feeds designed around variable reward, your dopaminergic pathways adjust. The anticipation of reward becomes more exciting than the reward itself. This is the core mechanism behind what researchers describe as reward prediction error. Your brain learns to respond not just to getting the reward, but to the possibility of getting it. And the unpredictability of that possibility is what makes it so sticky. Slot machines work on exactly this principle, and so does every social media feed. The scroll itself becomes the behavior the brain is chasing, not the content. Which means the content almost doesn't matter. What matters is the loop, the motion, the refresh, the unpredictable hit. That's what gets wired in. When you remove those inputs, the first thing that happens is not relief. The first thing that happens is a kind of restlessness that most people aren't prepared for. The brain has been running on a high-frequency reward schedule, and suddenly that schedule goes quiet. The system starts looking for the next signal. You feel bored, you feel irritable. You might feel a low-level anxiety that's hard to name because it doesn't seem connected to anything real. That's not a sign that something is wrong. That's the recalibration beginning. This phase typically lasts somewhere between 1 and 3 days for most people, though the duration varies depending on how saturated the inputs were and for how long. During this window, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for long-term planning, impulse regulation, and sustained attention, starts to get slightly more activity. Not because the detox is magical, but because the competing noise is lower. Think of it as signal clarity improving when the static drops. Here's where it gets interesting. Dopamine is not a happiness molecule. That's a widespread misconception. Dopamine is a motivation and prediction molecule. Its job is to signal that something worth pursuing is available and to encode that information into behavior over time. When the baseline level of low-value dopamine firing drops, because the inputs triggering it are gone, your sensitivity to real-world rewards starts to return. Tasks that felt flat or uninteresting before begin to register again. Reading a book feels like it has some pull to it. A conversation with a person has texture. Food tastes better. These aren't poetic descriptions. They reflect actual shifts in receptor sensitivity when the system isn't being flooded constantly. But here's the part that the weekend detox crowd misses entirely. That sensitivity only holds if you change what you return to. If the recalibration happens, and then you walk back into the exact same input environment, same apps, same habits, same frictionless access to variable reward, The system relearns those patterns within days. The neural pathways that were temporarily quieted reactivate. The baseline drops again. You're back where you started, maybe slightly worse, because now you know what you're missing and you went back anyway. Permanent change requires two things. First, you need to restructure your environment so that the high-frequency, low-value inputs are not the default. The behavioral science on this is clear. Friction determines behavior more than willpower does. If your phone is in your pocket and Instagram loads in 2 seconds, willpower is not a competitive force. But if access requires 3 extra steps, the behavior drops dramatically without requiring any conscious decision-making. Environment design is not a supplement to discipline. For most people, in most situations, it is discipline. Second, you need to fill the reclaimed attention with inputs that run on a slower reward schedule. Not because slower is morally superior, but because your reward circuitry needs to relearn how to tolerate the gap between effort and payoff. Long-form reading, creative work, physical training, extended conversation, these all involve delayed gratification in a form the brain can actually update its predictions around. Every time you stay with a hard task past the point where the urge to quit fires, you are literally retraining the prediction machinery. You're teaching the system that the reward is downstream of effort rather than immediate. This is why people who do this seriously often describe a shift in how they experience time. The weeks feel longer in a useful way. They're not busier, they're just more textured. More things register. And that's not mystical. It's what happens when your attention isn't being constantly pre-consumed by systems designed to hold it hostage. There's one more layer worth addressing, and it's something most content on this topic skips. The reason these patterns form in the first place is rarely just habit. People reach for constant stimulation because the alternative, stillness, open time, unstructured thought, can feel genuinely uncomfortable. Not because stillness is bad, but because when the noise stops, whatever you've been avoiding starts to surface. Anxiety about the future, dissatisfaction with the present, unprocessed things you haven't had the bandwidth to sit with because the feed was always available to fill the gap. A real dopamine detox, taken seriously, eventually puts you in contact with that material. And that's not a side effect to push through. That's actually the point where the most meaningful recalibration happens, because those unresolved things are often what drove the overconsumption in the first place. You can redesign your environment and retrain your reward circuitry. But if the underlying discomfort that was being self-medicated by noise doesn't get addressed, the pullback toward high-frequency inputs stays strong. This doesn't mean you need therapy to do a dopamine detox. It means you need to be willing to sit with discomfort long enough to actually feel what's there. Journaling works for this. So does any practice that creates enough stillness for thoughts to form and complete themselves rather than getting interrupted before they land. So what does a serious version of this actually look like in practice? Remove the highest frequency inputs for a minimum of 72 hours. Social media, short-form video, anything with a variable reward loop built into the interface. During that window, pay attention to what the restlessness actually feels like rather than immediately solving it. Notice what thoughts come up when there's nothing to scroll into. Then, before you return anything to your environment, make a deliberate decision about what earns its place back and what doesn't. Not based on what feels good in the moment, but based on what the pattern of use actually produces over time. The systems that held your attention before weren't designed to be good for you. They were designed to hold your attention. Those are different objectives, and treating them as the same thing is where most people lose the thread. Your reward circuitry is not broken. It worked exactly as designed when given those inputs. The question is whether you want to keep running it on someone else's design, or start running it on your own. You've seen what floods the system. Now watch what the system does when it needs to avoid starting something hard. Please, like, share, and subscribe, and watch this video next.